What else can one say except Wild Swans by Yung Chang? Yung, you must be at least amazed.
Yes, I am. I am absolutely amazed. Yes.
I'm going to ask you, before we get into the details of the book, I'm going to ask you the question that everybody else has asked you, because I'd like to hear your answer for myself. Why do you think the book has been so successful?
Well, I really don't know, but I think there'll probably be a number of reasons. Perhaps one reason is that the book is a human story. It's the story of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. It's about the three women in the 20th century China. And I think a lot of people all over the world can identify with us, with our experience.
I was there at the NCR Prize in 1992, the night the book won, and John Fowles, who was the judge speaking for your book, said that the book's great success was its simplicity of writing. Do you agree with that?
I did write simply, I think. Well, the thing is, I feel that the writing shouldn't be a barrier between the readership and the message and the stories that I want to get across. So I think the less is more, and the simpler the better.
Let us now begin at the very beginning, and I will quote to you your own now famous first sentence, which is, "At the age of 15, my grandmother became the concubine of a warlord general." Yes. Not many family memoirs begin like that. So let us start with your grandmother. What was she like?
My grandmother was a lovely woman. When she was 2 years old, her feet were bound, crushed and bound. Her feet were literally 4 inches long when she was an adult.
Crushed?
Crushed.
How was this done?
She was, she was the concubine. She was born in 1909. Yes. And in her days, women had to have bound feet. But basically, only the big toe was allowed to grow. The other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone. And the binding was just to stop the broken bones from recovering. So from the age of 2, my grandmother lived in excruciating pain. When she was 15, as you know, she was given by her father to a warlord general to be his concubine. She was married to him for 6 days, and then he left for 6 years because he had many concubines dotted around China, and he only visited them when he was next in town. And the rest of the time, my grandmother lived as a virtual prisoner in the house he bought for her, and the servants were under orders to spy on her. But eventually, when the warlord general was dying, and when my grandmother realized that after his death she might lose her daughter, my mother, because my mother, as the blood descendant, had to be raised by the proper wife, not by a concubine. So my grandmother escaped with my mother. I mean, it was very difficult for her because she had bound feet, tiny feet, which were not supposed to walk.
The purpose of binding the feet is to make women appeal erotically, is it?
Supposed to be, yeah. Yes. And of course it's then gone into the myth, and families with girls would automatically bind their feet because they thought otherwise the girls wouldn't be able to have a good marriage.
What was your grandmother's character like?
She was very strong, and I think she had a very hard life. After she escaped from the warlord's mansion, she fell in love with an elderly Manchu doctor, Dr. Xia. Dr. Xia's entire family were against his marriage to my grandmother. He was a widower, and the family thought that my grandmother had been a concubine. She would bring shame to their family. Dr. Xia's eldest son was so upset that he shot himself in protest. But the marriage went ahead, and my grandmother had a very happy life with Dr. Xia, although, of course, they had to live, for example, under Japanese occupation in Manchukuo, and there were a lot of Japanese atrocities around them. There was then the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, and their lives were devastated. And then under the communists, my grandmother had to witness my mother's detention, and later in the Cultural Revolution, my mother's torture, and my mother was sent to a labor camp. My mother suffered over 100 those violent denunciation meetings, and all those was too much. I mean, too devastating to my grandmother. So she died very sadly, tragically, at the age of 60 in the Cultural Revolution.
When you think of her now, and this is a book full of incident, when you think of her now, do you think that there was one incident, no matter how small, which became the defining incident of her life?
I think my mother's denunciation in the Cultural Revolution became the point. That she felt that she just couldn't cope anymore. She had a very difficult life, but my mother was her entire life. And at this point, when my mother was my mother, was made to kneel on broken glass. When she came back, her knees were full of fragments of glass, and my grandmother had to make knee pads to put on my mother's knees. To first use a tweezer to take out all the fragments, and to put the knee pads on her knees. So on the next occasion, my mother could have knee pads, and my grandmother also made this waistband, padded waistband around my mother's waist, because at those violent denunciation meetings, people, those violent people would punch your weakest, your most vulnerable point. So my grandmother, I could see my grandmother just had was suffering so much with my mother.
What was the denunciation for?
Well, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, my father became one of the few who stopped this violence and atrocities and protested to Mao against the Cultural Revolution. So as a result, my father was denounced and tortured, driven insane, imprisoned.
As a traitor?
Because he spoke up. My mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father. But my mother refused. So she suffered because she stood by my father.
So here we are, your grandmother, great hardship, your mother, great hardship. And you?
Well, by comparison, I didn't suffer much at all, compared not just to my mother and grandmother, but to the majority of Chinese, because I was born into a very privileged background of the communist elite. In fact, I grew up so much taking hierarchy and the privilege for granted, because we had our own wet nurses. My siblings and I, we lived in an armed compound with cooks and drivers, gardeners, and so on. So I just took all this for granted. That when I first came to England, I thought England was wonderfully classless. And of course, my views have been modified over the years. And it was a very protected childhood, and also in those days. We led a very isolated life. China was totally cut off from the outside world. When we were children, I never met a foreigner until I was 23. And when we were children, when the boys played guerrilla warfare, which was like a cowboys and Indians, and the bad guys would always have rose thorns glued onto their noses to show they were foreigners. And the bad guys would say hello all the time, because in propaganda films, evil foreigners were always drinking Coca-Cola and saying hello. So we all thought hello was a swear word.
Nothing changes. Finally then, do you think that Wild Swans is in fact an atlas, a personal atlas of Chinese 20th century history?
I do think our lives reflect the history of 20th century China. Of course, every family story is unique, but it does reflect the lives of millions and millions of Chinese. I have many letters from Chinese readers. I mean, every one of them tells me how my family story reminds them of their family stories.